Bridges must withstand strong winds, traffic flows, and temperature fluctuations. They are built to last for decades. But sometimes a single mistake can destroy even the most grandiose structure. This happened with the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington state. It was opened in the mid-20th century. It was one of the longest suspension bridges in the world. It looked futuristic, light, and graceful. But it had an aerodynamic problem. In strong winds, the bridge began to sway. At first, the amplitude was small. Then, the waves became larger and larger. Eyewitnesses reported that the roadway rose and fell like the surface of water. In November of the same year, the wind reached a critical speed. The structure went into resonance. The amplitude of the oscillations increased sharply. The bridge twisted and bent at incredible angles. At some point, the structures couldn't withstand it, and it collapsed into the river. This incident became one of the most studied in engineering history. Since then, bridge designers have started to consider the impact of aerodynamic flows and resonance. Millennium Tower. Imagine you bought a luxury apartment in a skyscraper. The windows offer a panoramic view of San Francisco. Marble floors, glass walls, designer interior. And then you find out that the building is slowly tilting and sinking into the ground. We're talking about the Millennium Tower, one of the most expensive skyscrapers in the city. It was built in the early 2000s. The height is over 50 floors. Apartments cost tens of millions of dollars. But shortly after opening, residents began to notice strange things. Cracks appeared on the walls, doors stopped closing, glass started pressing against the frames, and in some apartments, they simply shattered. It turned out that the building is sinking. Engineers discovered that the foundation is not on bedrock, but on soft soil. The piles go down only 80 feet. But for such a height, a minimum of 120 was required. Just a few years after construction, the skyscraper had sunk 2 feet and tilted 20 inches. The residents filed a lawsuit against the developer. City authorities demanded that the structure be reinforced. Builders began work on stabilizing the foundation, but the process turned out to be more complicated than expected. Any intervention could only make the situation worse. At the moment, the skyscraper continues to sink. How long it will stand, no one knows. A glass nightmare. Modern skyscrapers are often built with glass facades. They look stylish, provide a lot of light, and make buildings appear lightweight. But sometimes glass can turn a building into a deadly trap. This happened in London with the walkie-talkie skyscraper. This building has an unusual shape, and its glass facade has a convex surface, but the architects did not consider one important factor: sun rays. On sunny days, the glass acted like a giant lens, collecting and directing light downwards, right onto the street. As a result, the temperature in that area rose so much that parked cars began to melt. The bodies of the cars warped, and plastic elements fell off. People passing by felt an intense heat. After several complaints, the problem had to be addressed. Engineers installed special protective panels to diffuse the light. Without this, the part of the street under the skyscraper would have remained dangerously hazardous. Stadium collapse. Stadiums must withstand enormous loads. Tens of thousands of spectators gather there. Concerts, competitions, and rallies are held there. But if there is a flaw in the design, a disaster can occur at any moment. This happened in Hartford, Connecticut, in the 1970s. The new Civic Center Stadium was supposed to be the pride of the city. But a few months before its official opening, a collapse occurred. Part of the roof caved in under the weight of the snow. At that moment, the stadium was empty and no one was injured. But if it had happened during a game, there could have been hundreds of casualties. The investigation revealed that the designers miscalculated the load. The roof's connecting joints were weakened. Under normal conditions, they could support the weight of the structure. But once the additional load of snow was added, the system failed. After the disaster, the stadium was closed for reconstruction. The supports were reinforced, and the load distribution system was changed. But even after reopening, people were afraid to visit it for a long time, fearing new collapses. Well, if you need a truly reliable home, office, warehouse, or other facility, contact the professionals from the Production Association. System. This is a leading manufacturing enterprise offering a full range of services from designing modular buildings and houses for various purposes, of any complexity, to developing design projects, including interior finishing. The team provides a guarantee for their work, which is very important in our time. The office complex that was cracking. When cracks appear in a new building, it's a serious signal. But if a building is literally splitting apart, the situation becomes critical. In South Korea, a modern office complex called Sky Building was constructed. It was supposed to become a symbol of progress and technology. But soon after opening, problems began to appear. First, small cracks, then loud bangs resembling explosion sounds. Office workers complained that the floor was vibrating. New damages appeared on the walls. Engineers began an investigation and discovered the problem. The columns couldn't withstand the load. There were gross errors in the design. Some load-bearing elements were weakened due to incorrect weight distribution. Authorities took urgent measures. The complex was closed, people were evacuated, and reinforcement of the structure began. But the building had already lost its reputation. Many companies refused to rent, and insurance companies did not want to insure it. The shopping mall that collapsed. Shopping malls are built to withstand enormous loads. Thousands of people pass through every day, and hundreds of stores operate. But if there are errors in the construction, the building can turn into a deadly trap. This happened in South Korea in the 1990s. Sampoong, department store, an elite shopping center in Seoul. A 5-story building, luxurious boutiques, a huge food court. On the day of the disaster, there were over 1,500 people inside. It all started with cracks in the ceiling. Workers noticed them a few days before the collapse. Then strange sounds began to be heard, similar to the screeching of metal. But the management of the center ignored the warning. Suddenly, the structure gave way. A huge part of the building collapsed inward like a house of cards. The collapse lasted only a few seconds. Hundreds of people were trapped under the rubble. The investigation revealed that the cause was negligence. Weak concrete columns were used during construction, and additional floors were added on top, which were not in the original design. The structure simply couldn't withstand the overload. The broken pyramid. In Egypt, there are dozens of ancient pyramids. They have survived thousands of years, earthquakes, and sandstorms. But there is one mysterious structure that remains unfinished. The bent pyramid in Dashur. It attracts attention with its strange shape. The lower part has one angle of inclination, while the upper part has a completely different one. Why did the builder suddenly change the design? Scientists believe the reason lies in engineering miscalculations. Initially, the pyramid was being built at an angle of 54 degrees. But when the height reached 150 feet, cracks appeared in the structure. The foundation couldn't support the weight of the massive stone blocks. To prevent a disaster, the builders changed the angle of inclination to 43 degrees. This allowed them to reduce the load and complete the construction. But this shape made the pyramid unconventional. And soon it was decided to completely abandon this method. This mistake became an important lesson. After this, engineers in ancient Egypt began building pyramids with more gradual slopes, which allowed them to stand for millennia. The bridge that couldn't hold. Automobile bridges are designed to withstand loads for many years. But sometimes a small error in calculations can lead to disaster. This happened in 2007 in Minneapolis. A 35W Mississippi River Bridge, an important bridge over the Mississippi River. Tens of thousands of cars crossed it daily. But one evening, a sudden crash was heard, and the bridge collapsed right into the water. At the time of the disaster, there were over 100 vehicles on it. Cars were falling from a height of 80 feet. Some were instantly trapped under the rubble of metal and concrete. The investigation revealed that the cause was in the design of the connecting plates. They turned out to be too thin for such loads. Over time, the metal began to deform and eventually could not withstand the weight of the structure. After this tragedy, bridges across the country began to be inspected for hidden defects. Destroyed. Airport. Airports are complex engineering structures. Each terminal must withstand a huge flow of passengers, luggage, and climatic loads. But even here, there can be mistakes that may lead to disaster. In the 2000s, a new terminal was opened at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. It was supposed to be an architectural masterpiece, with modern design, glass walls, and smooth lines. But a few months after opening, part of the roof collapsed right into the waiting area. The problem was in the construction. The arch supports holding up the roof were not strong enough. The materials couldn't withstand the load, and temperature fluctuations made the situation even worse. As a result, one of the sections of the terminal simply fell apart. After that, the airport had to be urgently reinforced. Now its construction is reliable, but the collapse incident served as a reminder that even in the most modern buildings, there can be serious engineering miscalculations. A house that couldn't withstand the wind. When residential complexes are built, they are expected to last for decades. But sometimes even a small mistake can make a building vulnerable. In the 2000s, a luxury residential complex called Lotus Riverside was built in Shanghai. 10 high-rise buildings, modern architecture, convenient location. But one night, one of the buildings simply toppled over. Surveillance cameras captured how the building slowly leaned and then, with a loud crash, fell to the ground. It remained almost intact, just lying on its side like a giant domino. The investigation revealed that the cause was the foundation. During construction, the builders dug a pit next to the building but did not reinforce it. The rains washed away the soil, and the building was destroyed. Support. This disaster was a shock to the construction industry. After that, China began to more strictly control foundation work. Well, a skyscraper, deformed by the wind. Modern skyscrapers withstand strong winds. They are designed with aerodynamics, calculated loads, and oscillations in mind. But sometimes even the best technologies cannot fully protect the structure. This happened in Dubai with the Cayenne Tower, one of the most unusual skyscrapers in the world. Its height is over 1,000 feet. Its distinctive feature is its twisted shape. Each floor is rotated a few degrees relative to the previous one. This creates a spiral effect and makes the building look impressive. But a few years after construction was completed, engineers noticed alarming signs. Due to the design features and wind loads, microcracks began to appear on the upper floors. The windows were experiencing high stress. In buildings of such height, special dampers are usually installed, but due to the shape of the Cayenne Tower, some calculations turned out to be insufficient. The structure continues to withstand the loads, but experts are monitoring it with special attention. Any slightest changes in the framework can lead to serious consequences. An unsuccessful underground tunnel. Underground tunnels must be reliable. They are built to last for decades, withstand traffic flows and ground vibrations. But sometimes a project can turn into a disaster even before completion. This happened in Boston. One of the most expensive transportation projects in U.S. history. It is a system of underground tunnels designed to alleviate road traffic. But from the very beginning, the construction faced problems. The first mistake was the use of poor quality concrete. The tunnel walls began to crack even before the work was completed. Then there was a water leak. The joints between the panels could not withstand the pressure. But the serious disaster was the collapse of part of the structure. One of the concrete slabs, weighing over 10 tons, suddenly fell onto the roadway. Engineers conducted an investigation and found that the cause was poor quality fastenings. The project required urgent reconstruction, and its final cost exceeded the initial estimates several times over. Record-breaking ghost hotel. Skyscrapers are usually built over several years, but sometimes a project turns into a long-term construction that will never be completed. This happened with the Ryugyong Hotel in North Korea. This gigantic building is over 1,000 feet tall. It was supposed to become the most luxurious hotel in the country. But already during the construction phase, the project encountered serious problems. Firstly, the funding was suspended several times. But the main problem was engineering errors. The building's design turned out to be too complex, and the load on the frame was distributed unevenly. Additionally, outdated technologies were used, and the quality of the concrete did not meet global standards. As a result, the building stood unfinished for several decades. Only recently was it clad in glass, but the question remains whether it will ever be completed. Citigroup Center. The tower that swayed. When building skyscrapers, it's important to consider not only the height but also the resistance to loads. The slightest error in calculations can lead to disaster. Citigroup Center is one of the most recognizable skyscrapers in New York. Its distinctive feature is the massive columns located not at the corners, but at the center of each side of the building. This allowed a church to be placed directly underneath it. But, a year after construction was completed, engineers discovered a terrifying mistake. The design did not account for how the wind would affect the building. Under certain conditions, a strong hurricane could cause critical oscillations, and the tower could collapse. The problem was resolved, but the work was done secretly. Every night, builders reinforced the structure's connections. If the information had leaked to the press, it could have caused panic. This case became one of the most famous examples of hidden engineering errors in skyscrapers. Palm Islands. Dangerous skyscrapers in the water. Construction on artificial islands is a complex task, especially when it comes to high-rise buildings. The slightest error in calculations can lead to disaster. In Dubai, a project was created. Palm Islands, artificial archipelagos where hotels, residential complexes, and skyscrapers are being built. But a few years after the completion of construction, problems began to appear. The ground on which the buildings stand turned out to be unstable. The foundations began to settle. Some structures developed microcracks. Moreover, due to miscalculations in design, water began to erode sections of land. Today, scientists and engineers are monitoring these changes. But the question remains open: will this mega project last as long as planned? Destruction under load. Buildings where thousands of people work must be as safe as possible. Any construction error can lead to tragedy. This happened in Bangladesh in 2013. In the city of Savar stood the 8-story Rana Plaza building. It housed shops, offices, and garment factories. Thousands of workers came here daily. The day before the disaster, cracks appeared on the walls. Some employees refused to enter the building, but the factory owners ordered them to continue working. And the next morning, the structure couldn't hold. The building collapsed in a matter of seconds. The cause was gross violations during construction. The foundation did not meet standards, and the load from the heavy equipment was too high. This tragedy became one of the largest man-made disasters in the history of Bangladesh. After it, new construction standards were introduced in the country, but the question remains: how reliable are the old buildings? Concrete that cracks. The quality of materials is one of the key factors in construction. Even the most well-thought-out structure can collapse if the concrete is not strong enough. This happened in the United Kingdom with the Apollo House skyscraper. The building was erected in the mid-20th century. It was a standard residential complex designed for thousands of people. But after a few decades, alarming signs began to appear. The walls were covered with cracks, and in some places, concrete blocks were chipping off. Engineers conducted a study and found that low-quality concrete was used during construction. Over time, the material began to deteriorate due to moisture and temperature. As a result, the building was declared hazardous. Residents were relocated, and the complex itself was demolished. This case served as a reminder that even concrete can fail if construction technologies are not followed. The tower, the most expensive unfinished building. Some projects cost billions of dollars. They are supposed to become symbols of engineering progress. But sometimes grand constructions turn into unfinished projects. This is what happened with the tower project in Dubai. This building was supposed to become the tallest in the world, surpassing the famous Burj Khalifa. It was planned that its height would exceed 3,000 feet. But problems arose during the construction process. First, the cost of the project increased every year. Second, the engineering calculations turned out to be more complex than anticipated. The ground on which the building was being constructed required additional reinforcements. As a result, the construction was halted. Today, at the site where the tower was supposed to stand, only the foundation and a few unfinished structures remain. A residential complex that no one accepted. Sometimes buildings are constructed with grand plans, but in the end, they remain empty. Prora is a huge residential complex in Germany. Its construction began in the 1930s, in the 20th century. It was planned to accommodate tens of thousands of people. It was supposed to become one of the largest resort complexes in Europe. But, after the construction was completed, Prora was never used as intended. The war changed the plans, and the buildings remained empty. Decades later, there were attempts to turn them into hotels, residential apartments, and museums. But most of the complex is still uninhabited. This case shows that even the largest projects can turn into ghost towns. Engineering mistakes that are repeated. Construction is a complex process. Engineers use the latest technologies and perform thousands of calculations. But despite this, mistakes continue to be repeated. The same problems have plagued the construction industry for decades. Insufficient foundations, miscalculations in loads, use of poor quality materials, ignoring natural factors. We see skyscrapers that lean, bridges that collapse, and buildings that cannot support their own weight. Each case has its own cause. But the main question remains: do we really learn from our mistakes?